In the previous video, we talked about cardiac output and how we can measure it in a different way using mean arterial pressure and resistance. And the equation was CO equals MAP over R. In this video, we're going to focus on the factors that affect blood pressure and how we can control blood pressure and blood flow. So if I were to rearrange this specific equation that we saw in the previous video, I can write MAP equals cardiac output times resistance. And if we look at this type of equation, you can note that whatever affects cardiac output, whatever causes it to go up, it will also influence mean arterial pressure to go up. There's a direct relationship. And whatever causes the resistance to go up is going to do the same thing to mean arterial pressure. It will influence it to go up as well. So all of the factors that influence cardiac output and cause it to increase can also cause the pressure to go up. And any factor that influences the resistance to go up will also cause mean arterial pressure to go up. We've studied the effect of blood viscosity, vessel length, and lumen size on resistance. And we also know the factors that can influence cardiac output in relation to stroke volume and heart rate. So anything that causes cardiac output to go up, anything that causes resistance to go up will eventually cause the pressure to go up. But how can we control the pressure once it's higher or lower than usual? What are some of the homeostatic mechanisms that we employ to keep everything constant? One of the major ways we can regulate or control blood pressure and blood flow is through a group of neurons that we find in the medulla, we call the cardiovascular center. This group of neurons can regulate heart rate, force of contraction, as well as blood vessel diameter. So how does it do that? It can receive input from higher brain centers, such as the hypothalamus or the cerebral cortex. And it can also receive input from different sensory receptors. What are these sensory receptors? We're talking about proprioceptors, baroreceptors, and chemoreceptors. And these are constantly monitoring conditions such as blood pressure, blood acidity, and then sending impulses or signals to the cardiovascular center in the medulla. Now, the output from the cardiovascular center, so what goes out, goes through the parasympathetic or sympathetic fibers. So what are some things that are controlled by the sympathetic fibers? One of which is increased heart rate and contractility. So these neurons innervate the heart directly and cause it to beat faster or increase the force of contraction. The other stimulation is through the vasomotor nerves that will cause the smooth muscle in the blood vessel walls to continuously, moderately contract, creating what we call a vasoconstriction or vasomotor tone. And we also have stimulation through the parasympathetic neurons, which will do the opposite here and contribute to a decrease in heart rate, especially if the initial stimulus is an increase in blood pressure. Let's take a look at how these sensory receptors stimulate these changes that we see to control blood pressure. Let's start first with baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are receptors that are sensitive to changes in the pressure, especially pressure due to the stretching of the walls of the blood vessels in the atria. We find those receptors concentrated in a couple of areas. Number one, in the arch of the aorta. So we find some of the baroreceptors here. And these are concerned with just general changes in the blood pressure in the systemic circuit. And we find them in this arch. And then we have the baroreceptors in the carotid sinus. And this one is involved in maintaining blood pressure in the brain. And in this case, once there's high pressure in the vessels, it's going to contribute to the stretching of sensory receptors. And once these stretch, that's their trigger to send their signal to the cardiovascular center. And in the cardiovascular center, we're going to see a series of responses that will bring the blood pressure down. So what are some of these responses? If we have increased blood pressure, that is going to increase the stretching of the baroreceptors, which means they'll send their signals onto the cardiovascular center in the medulla oblongata. The cardiovascular center will then fire some signals that will decrease heart rate, decrease stroke volume. So in this case, we're trying to suppress the sympathetic nervous system and stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system because we want to bring the heart rate down. And for the vessels, we want them to dilate because as the vessels dilate, there's an increase in the diameter of the lumen that will lead to less of a resistance, less of blood pressure, bringing the blood pressure down. The opposite is also true. If we have a decrease in blood pressure, maybe because there's not enough blood, there's not enough water, that can be a trigger here, a low blood pressure type of state. And that will cause these baroreceptors to stretch less. And if they stretch less, that's another signal basically to the cardiovascular center in the medulla oblongata that these specific receptors are not firing as much as they need to. They're sending signals at a lower rate, and that will lead to a decrease in parasympathetic stimulation and an increase in sympathetic stimulation because we want the heart to beat faster, we want the stroke volume to go up, and so that's going to cause a stimulation of the sympathetic division, causing an increase in heart rate and force of contraction. At the same time, we want to increase the constriction of the vessels, so there's a decrease in the lumen size, and in that way the blood pressure then goes up. We go back to homeostasis. So the changes here are due to the changes in the stretching of the walls that will either send more signals or less signals to the cardiovascular center. And depending on those signals, the cardiovascular center will stimulate either the parasympathetic or the sympathetic system. We also have receptors that respond to changes in chemical composition. For example, pick up changes in the amount of oxygen, in the amount of carbon dioxide, also in the amount of H+, how acidic the blood is. There are certain things that contribute to the activation of these receptors. These receptors are constantly monitoring these chemicals, and these chemoreceptors are found close to the baroreceptors where we discussed their location. So if the blood levels of oxygen goes down, if the carbon dioxide level goes up, or the hydrogen ion concentration goes up, that all means that there's not enough oxygen in the blood and we need more of it. So like I said, increase in CO2, increase in H+, and decrease in O2 all mean the same thing. There's not enough O2, there's too much CO2, the blood is too acidic. And that will stimulate these chemoreceptors to fire their signals to the cardiovascular center, which then will stimulate the sympathetic response. And we know that the sympathetic response is involved in increasing heart rate, contractility, which means that the heart is going to beat faster, more oxygen will be replenished, and then that will contribute to an increase of oxygen in the blood. It will cause these vessels to constrict, bringing the blood pressure up, and then also we want to make sure that the kidneys can excrete some of this hydrogen out of the body, and that will cause the kidneys to let go of the extra H+ in the bloodstream. So these are a couple of ways blood pressure can be maintained, specifically through neural control and the involvement of the nervous system. But we also have hormonal control or regulation. These are some of the ways that we can control blood pressure in relation to the nervous system and nervous control. We can also control blood pressure hormonally through the secretion of different types of chemicals in the bloodstream. One system that is involved in regulating blood pressure is called the RAA system, or renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And the way these names are listed in order, that is how these chemicals are secreted or activated in that order. We're not going to go into too much detail for this chapter on this system, but in general, if the blood pressure is low, if there's not enough sodium in the blood, there's not enough just water, blood volume in general. So we're talking about a situation where the blood pressure is low to begin with. That will trigger the secretion of this chemical called renin. This hormone is secreted from the kidneys, to be exact. And once it's secreted, it's going to cause the conversion of another enzyme called angiotensinogen. It's going to convert it into angiotensin 1. Once we have angiotensin 1, we have another enzyme that will convert it into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 has a bunch of effects. The ones we're interested in is that it increases the resistance of the vascular system, so it's going to cause vasoconstriction, and when we see constriction, we see the resistance go up, so will the blood pressure. And it will also stimulate the thirst center, which will induce the body to drink more water, eventually contributing to a higher blood volume. At the same time, and this is what we're interested in as well, is that the angiotensin 2 will stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone is a chemical that, the hormone specifically, that can influence the reabsorption of sodium in the kidneys. So your kidneys will not let go of the sodium. Instead, it will reabsorb it and put it back into the bloodstream. If you have more sodium, that's usually an indication of more water. So the body will retain more water if there's more sodium. If the sodium levels are high, the fluid levels are high, we're back to normal blood volume and back to high blood pressure. So if you don't have enough sodium to begin with, then the body will not be able to retain as much water as it's supposed to. That is what the trigger was initially. So that's the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Other hormones that can be involved here are epinephrine and norepinephrine. I'm sure you've seen these hormones before. They can also act as neurotransmitters because we know that they are related to the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So these chemicals are specifically secreted from the adrenal medulla. They can alter blood pressure and blood flow because they can alter the cardiac output, how much the heart beats per minute. And it can also contribute to changes in the resistance by changing the diameter of the lumen by causing vasoconstriction or vasodilation. So for epinephrine and norepinephrine, once they are secreted because of sympathetic stimulation, we see an increase in heart rate, which increases cardiac output. We also see that they have a function in vasoconstriction, which increases resistance and increases pressure as well. So all of that is related. If the blood pressure is low to begin with, that will stimulate the sympathetic division to cause the heart to beat more, faster, and also cause vasoconstriction, which in general, all of that will bring the blood pressure back to normal. The third hormone is antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is produced by the hypothalamus. However, it's stored in the pituitary gland and it's secreted when there's not enough water in the body, so during dehydration or decrease in blood volume. And that's the trigger. So if you don't have enough water, fluid in the blood, that means the pressure is low, blood pressure is low. So if the blood pressure is low to begin with, that's the trigger here for the secretion of ADH. So we're going to see an increase in ADH, which once it's secreted, it's going to do a bunch of things. It's going to stimulate the thirst center, so you're going to drink more water. It's going to stimulate the vasoconstriction of blood vessels, which we know causes the blood pressure to go up. And it's also going to promote the reabsorption of water in the kidneys. So your body retains more water and brings the blood pressure back up. So a bunch of outcomes here because of ADH secretion. The last hormone that I want to discuss is AMP, or atrial natriuretic peptide. This one specifically is the one that's going to function the opposite to the first three mechanisms that we discussed. So with ANP, this one is released when there's high blood pressure. This is a peptide that is produced by the atria of the heart, and it will be secreted when blood pressure is high. So when blood pressure is high, there's more stretching in the heart, and that's the trigger. Once ANP is secreted, then it will cause vasodilation. Vasodilation is the increase in the diameter of the blood vessels. It also promotes the secretion of water and salt in urine. So when you get rid of salt and water, you're essentially decreasing the blood volume, so the blood pressure can go back down. And so this is the only one that functions in the opposite mechanism to the RAA, ADH, epi, nor epinephrine. So all in all, this is related. We're not only looking at one mechanism. Usually several of these mechanisms occur at the same time. And if the blood pressure drops initially, there's a few things that will happen. Short-term answers or fixes to this problem are activation of the sympathetic response. So we see an increase in epi nor epi in this case, which will lead to higher CO. We can see vasoconstriction as outcomes, which will cause the blood pressure to go up. If the drop in blood pressure is long-term, then this is when the kidneys produce renin, and we saw the RAA system. We can stimulate thirst this way. We can cause aldosterone secretion at the end, which again will contribute to vasoconstriction. It will contribute to reabsorption of sodium, water retention, and an increase in blood pressure. Another hormone that can be evolved is EPO. This one will increase the production of red blood cells, and if you have more red blood cells, that will cause the blood volume to go up as well. So all of these responses happen at the same time. It just depends on the location and how long the blood pressure drop lasts. I want to bring attention here quickly to the fact that the tissues are able to automatically auto-regulate their own blood flow to match their metabolic need. So essentially, oxygen is a principal stimulus for autoregulation. If the tissue needs lots of oxygen, then it's going to automatically adjust how much blood flows through that area. There are other stimuli that can lead to autoregulation. Physical and chemical stimuli can achieve this. For example, physical change can include warming. So if the temperature of that area goes up, that contributes to vasodilation. And if there's vasodilation, there's more blood flow to that area. Chemical stimuli that can lead to autoregulation include nitric oxide, or NO. NO is known as a vasodilator, and it can be secreted in local areas to cause the vasodilation of the vessels in that area and increase blood flow to the desired tissue to deliver more oxygens and remove waste. So certain tissues can do this. They can regulate their own blood flow, and this is, of course, all locally. The changes are not happening systemically. In this video, we explored the different factors or different conditions that can control blood flow and blood pressure, including neural and hormonal mechanisms.